Thank you all for sticking it out for a very long and productive day of engaging with Zora Neale Hurston. I am Tammy Navarro. I'm the Associate Director of BCRW, and I have the great privilege of introducing our second keynote speaker today, Dr. Deborah Thomas. It has been my great privilege to know and work with Deborah Thomas for the better part of the past 2 decades. In addition to her transformative anthropological work, Professor Thomas is a deeply dedicated mentor to and champion of junior scholars fortunate enough to engage with her. Not only has Deborah Thomas shepherded me through my academic career, she also introduced me to it, taking the time to explain the complexity and realities of anthropology and graduate study to a flailing college student. It's not an exaggeration to say that I stand here today as an anthropologist because of the scholarship and guidance of Professor Deborah Thomas, so thank you. I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to introduce Professor Thomas. She is the R. Jean Brownlee Term Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also core faculty in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, holds a secondary appointment with the Graduate School of Education, and is a member of the graduate groups in English, Africana Studies, and the School of Social Policy and Practice. Prior to her appointment at Penn, she spent 2 years as a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Americas at Wesleyan University, and 4 years teaching in the Department of Cultural Anthropology at Duke University. She is the author of Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica, Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Culture in Jamaica, and is a co-editor of Globalization and Race, Transformations in the Cultural Production of Blackness. Prior to her life as an academic, Thomas was a professional dancer with the New York-based Urban Bushwomen, a company that is committed to using art as a means of addressing issues of social justice and encouraging civic engagement, and that brings the untold stories of disenfranchised people to light through dance from a woman-centered perspective and as members of the African diaspora community. Thomas was the editor of the journal Transforming Anthropology from 2007 to 2010, and is currently on the editorial committee of the Caribbean-based journal Social and Economic Studies. She's the editor-in-chief of American Anthropologist, the flagship journal of the American Anthropological Association, and currently sits on the board of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora. Please join me in welcoming Professor Deborah Thomas.
Wow, I'm so honored to be here and be part of this day. It's been really amazing to listen to the young scholars and my 2 former students. And it's true, I had Tammy on my very first trip that I took, students with me in Jamaica while I was on a postdoc, and she was a junior, at Wesleyan University. So it's just been really great listening to you all, and I feel also replenished. Okay, so think about what to add, but I think actually the discussions have been so cumulative all day, so you'll hear resonances again here, I think, with things that have been discussed already. All right, so I went to Brown University. I did not go to Columbia. I went to Brown in the mid and late 1980s, so the literary reclamation of Zora Neale Hurston was well underway by that time, and I read everything I could get my hands on. Their Eyes Were Watching God was the first book that we discussed in my Black Women Writers class, and from there I moved on to Mules and Men, Jonah's Gourdvine, and her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road. By the time I graduated and moved to New York City to dance, I had found in her and in Katherine Dunham kindred spirits of a sort, Black women who lived vitally and, moreover, who flouted the Black nationalist norms that were circulating in their moments. Many of Zora's books toured with me while I was dancing with the Urban Bushwomen, and I mined them for insights about what it meant to be an artist and a cultural observer at the same time, and about how this union marked a kind of political action in which I was already interested and involved. I didn't encounter Tell My Horse, however, until I was in graduate school. having landed by very circuitous routing in an MA program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU, and having only then discovered anthropology, my eyes were turned toward the way artists, and particularly dancers, were central to an anti-colonial program designed to reorient the ways Jamaicans approach their African cultural heritage. In other words, I wanted to understand something about the relationship between nationalism and cultural politics, to see the ways that dancers, musicians, performers, and plastic artists established a web of institutions to promote research and training in and performance of Afro-Jamaican expressive arts forms. I also wanted to know whether and how this project had changed over time, and what new ideas were brought into it by new generations of artists. And finally, I wanted to know whether any of this really mattered to those who weren't directly involved. How, why, and when did people attach to these projects, and when didn't they? What did they feel represented them most or least? What could this tell us about nationalism, globalization, and cultural politics more broadly? By the time I had identified these as research questions, I had already applied to continue my graduate studies in the Department of Anthropology at NYU, and I spent hours upon hours in Bob's library. Then we still had card catalogs, and I spent my first year of the PhD program slowly making my way through every entry under Jamaica. I sat on the floor in the stacks, paging through planters' diaries, political science and economic texts, linguistic analyses of patois, early reports of research on racial mixing that was funded by eugenics supporters, historical accounts of every period of Spanish and British imperialism in the Caribbean and of every slave revolt, of peasant production and trade union development, and of the emergent nationalist movement. I read the little bit of literary criticism that was available on West Indian literature at the time, and then I saw it. Zora had been to Jamaica and Haiti as an anthropologist, and she wrote about it. I nearly cried. Part travelogue and part anthropological analysis, Tell My Horse chronicles Zora's experiences in Jamaica and Haiti on 2 Guggenheim Fellowships awarded in 1936 and 1937. She traveled to Jamaica in April 1936 to study West Indian obia practices, and in September that year, she went to Haiti, where she wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God in 7 weeks, and then continued her education in Vodun until March 1937. That May, she returned to Haiti on a fellowship renewal for an additional 6 months. The mid-1930s were an important period in both Jamaica and Haiti, but for different reasons. Within Jamaica, this moment is often seen as the beginning of the initial stirrings of rebellion, a banana workers' disturbance in Arocabessa, a dock workers' strike in Falmouth, stirrings that would lead to massive region-wide labor riots by 1938. These riots would lead to the intensification of the trade union movement and the establishment of nationalist parties. They would also precipitate the initiation of a process whereby Great Britain would relinquish these colonies and support various kinds of self-government under the watchful and increasingly interested eyes of the United States, now asserting its dominance throughout the Western Hemisphere. In Haiti, 1936 marked 2 years after the US Marines left the country, following an almost 20-year occupation that began in 1915, just after the outbreak of World War I, in the face of growing German settlement in and control of the Haitian economy. Zora begins the Haitian section of Tell My Horse with an allegorical retelling of the events that led up to the assassination of President Villepreux-Guillaume Sam, and the subsequent arrival of the USS Washington. Shockingly, for our sensibilities today, she portrays the Marine occupation as finally bringing peace and freedom to the Black people of Haiti, who since the revolution had suffered from one greedy president for life to the next. In Zora's rendering, the arrival of US Marines, quote, was the last hour of the last day of the last year that ambitious and greedy demagogues could substitute bought Keko blades for voting power. It was the end of the revolution and the beginning of peace, end quote. Of course, we now know that this first US occupation of Haiti created a devastating legacy with which we all still contend. But nevertheless, this was the context in which Zora went to study obia and Vodun. Certainly, Tell My Horse gives us quite a few ethnographic meaty bits regarding Caribbean religious alterities. But not surprisingly, Zora also tells us many other important things. She tells us, for example, about the peculiarities of Jamaican racial striving among the brown middle classes. Quote, "There is a frantic stampede whiteward to escape from Jamaica's black mass," she writes, as she describes a kinship system that honors white ancestry so elaborately, quote, "that first, second, third, and fourth degrees of illegitimacy are honored in order of their nearness to the source of whiteness," end quote. This is the kind of observation that would become central to later anthropological writing in the late 1970s. Jack Alexander, a structuralist anthropologist, would also argue that middle-class Jamaicans reckon their genealogies in relation to a common origin story featuring a non-legal union between a white male master and a black female slave that produced illegitimate brown offspring who held a middling status between master and slave. At the initial point of this story, Alexander argued, class, status, and race were directly correlated. But the origin story achieved mythic status because it was seen as having operational value in the present, explaining not only the past but also the future, and rooting citizenship in Creoleness, which ended up being the dominant mid-20th century ideology of middle-class nationalists. With her usual humor, Zora lampoons the anxieties of this class. She writes, "When a Jamaican is born of a black woman and some English or Scotsman, the black mother is literally and figuratively kept out of sight as far as possible. But no one is allowed to forget that white father, however questionable the circumstances of birth. You get the impression that these virile Englishmen do not require women to reproduce." In her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road, she continues this critique by arguing that black folk love being mimics, that even the Haitian Revolution was held, quote, right behind the white one in France. She goes on, "As badly as the Ethiopians hated to part with Haile Selassie and freedom, it must be some comfort to have Mussolini for a model. By now, all the Rosses and other big shots are twitching out their lips ferociously, gritting their teeth, and otherwise making faces like Il Duce. And I'll bet you a fat man against Sweetback that all the little boy Ethiopians are doing a mean powder pigeon strut around Addis Ababa. And right here in these United States, we don't miss doing a thing that the white folks do, possible or impossible. Education, sports, keeping up with the Joneses, and the whole shebang. The unanswerable retort to criticism is, the white folks do it, don't they?" The irony of her affect and her obvious commitment throughout her work to a deep black sociality might lead us to ask what she's playing at here, lovingly mirroring her fellow folk, my people, while subtly pointing the more accusatory finger at the white world that looms but so seldom actually appears in the social horizons of her characters. Zora also reviews common kinship arrangements in Tell My Horse, noting that Jamaicans don't tend to get married until they've spent a long time seeing if they live well together, and even raising children to adulthood before tying the knot. They wait until they have the money, and in the meantime, they live and work together like any two people who have been married by the preacher. It is incidentally true that the percentage of children born in Jamaica to parents who are married to each other has not appreciably changed since emancipation in 1838. Today, however, we would not attribute this, as Zora does, to the delayed elaboration of an aspirational norm toward middle-class respectability. Instead, we would argue that in Jamaica, marriage is not universally seen as the basis of legitimate family formation. When I first read the book, I also remember as very striking and not a little titillating her description of the specialists in Jamaica who prepare young girls for love. She had heard of this common enough practice and asked to study the matter at close range. She observed one of those specialists, always old women, she wrote, who have lived with a great deal of subtlety themselves and who have already passed through the active period and become widows. A woman who served in an advisory capacity for a young girl about to be married or about to become the mistress of an influential man. The wish, she writes, is to bring complete innocence and complete competence together in the same girl. She describes how this process is realized. For a few days, the old woman does not touch her. She is taking her pupil through the lecture stages of instruction. Among other things, she is told that the consummation of love cannot properly take place in a bed. Soft beds are not for love. They are comforts for the old and lackadaisical. In addition, she is instructed at length on muscular control inside her body and out, and this was also rehearsed again and again. On the day of the wedding, Zora relates, the old woman bathes the girl in hot water with herbs. No soap is used at this point, she writes. It is a medicinal sweating tub to open the pores and stimulate the candidate generally. She continues. Days before, the old woman has prepared an extract from these roots in oil, and it is at hand in a bowl. She begins and massages the girl from head to foot with this fragrant unction. The toes, the fingers, the thighs. You can see where this is going. Now, I'll make you look it up to learn the rest, which is quite exhilarating. All the more so because before reading Tell My Horse, I had never, ever, not once, ever heard of this kind of practice in Jamaica. So perhaps this falls into the category of knowledge that is shared only on a need-to-know basis. In Jamaica, Zora goes on to tell us about a visit to the Akampong Maroons, the very same community that Catherine Dunham had visited only a few months earlier. With the Maroons, she not only built a stove, but also participated in a wild hog hunt. She also tells us about a curry goat feed that had been prepared in her honor in St. Mary, and she lets us know that this is something, quote, that has never been done for another woman. A group of musicians appears at the goat feed and begins to play, all strong and raw, but magnificent music and dancing. All along, she argues with Jamaicans about what she sees as their backward ideas about gender norms and the place of women, and she takes in the folk tales and duppy stories in a way familiar to anyone who has read Mules and Men. So there are two analytic trajectories that I feel are key to a contemporary reading of Tell My Horse. The first has to do with where Zora fits into what emerges as a trend in the early years of the 20th century. Americans publishing travelogues outlining their assessments of the new empire growing up quickly around them. Zora is certainly not the first ethnographer to have explored the Caribbean. She's preceded by several scholars, more properly characterized as folklorists, like Martha Beckwith, who gives us Black Roadways in 1929, and Walter Jekyll, who offers up Jamaica's Song and Story in 1907. By the time Zora comes on the scene, of course, Melville Herskovits had already laid out his programmatic vision for studying the Negro in the New World and had himself conducted research in Haiti, Trinidad, and Dutch Guyana. And Alan Lomax had also spent a year recording traditional music in Haiti in 1936 and 1937. That the discovery of Africanisms in New World Black societies was an important political project within anti-colonial contexts is reflected in Sir Philip Sherlock's prefatory remarks to the 1966 edition of Jekyll's book. Sherlock, a Jamaican historian, champion of the popular arts, and the first vice-chancellor of the University of the West Indies, positioned Jekyll's efforts, and those of other scholars like him, as having bestowed value upon Anansi stories, it's like Brer Rabbit stories, and folk songs within a, quote, semi-feudal Jamaica of the old plantation, at a time when they were despised as Negro talk and old-time sayings. By 1966, 4 years after independence, these songs and stories would be repositioned as part of a legacy that has provided Jamaicans with a new identificatory certainty. As for Zora, for these early folklorists, these stories presented a theory of colonial life in a plantation zone, one that was peppered with tricksters, herbalists, and magicians, people who could make a way out of no way, or as we would say in Jamaica, turn on make fashion. Of course, other periods have also been marked by a proliferation of visitors, most notably the moment immediately after emancipation, when many missionaries and government functionaries alike traveled to the Caribbean from Great Britain and the United States to see the results of the Great Experiment. Toward the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, English visitors again arrived interested in the prospects, or lack thereof, for free trade and economic modernization. And after the Spanish-Cuban-American War, as Americans came to be convinced of their manifest destiny, not only westward, but also across the seas, many toured the islands during the 1920s and 30s to write about their new sphere of interest. Jamaican political scientist James Carnegie, writing about political developments during the early 20th century, noted that Jamaicans came to resent what he called the knocking of their country, arguing that, quote, those most guilty of this habit were American writers in sophisticated and intellectual magazines. For Carnegie, the chief knocker in the first decades of the 20th century was Harry Frank. Frank's book, Roaming Through the West Indies, which was published in 1920, is an account of a more than 6 months journey throughout the Caribbean, in which he includes Cuba and Puerto Rico as our West Indies, as well as the southern United States, which are just as exotic to him as the Caribbean. Frank is someone who has traveled extensively throughout Latin America, and he often compares what he's seeing in the Caribbean to similar phenomena occurring in countries like Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, and Venezuela. In Frank's 20-page chapter about Jamaica, he calls Kingston, quote, the most disappointing town in the West Indies. It is a Negro slum, he writes, spreading for miles over a dusty plain. For Frank, Kingston is the height of insolence, petty crime, disease, degeneracy, delinquency, and loose manners. Even the white officials are slow, antiquated, and precedence-ridden. In striking contrast, he argues, quote, to the young and bustling, if sometimes poorly informed, rulers of our own dependencies. Despite the obviousness of his racist assessments, Frank does manage to excoriate the British for land scarcity, among laborers, as well as an underdeveloped public education system. Like Zora, he shares a certain faith that the future of the West Indies lies with America, a view that is also stated by some of the Jamaicans he met on his journey, both black and white, but one that doesn't become palpable until after World War II, when there's talk of forgiving Britain's war debt to the United States by annexing its colonies. Not surprisingly, Frank's writings spurred both a defensive Jamaican pride and an increased anti-American sentiment that was unmitigated by more balanced assessments of Jamaica, such as the one penned by Raymond Buell in 1931 for Opportunity magazine, and later reprinted in The Gleaner. Buell's somewhat romanticist take on the Caribbean, he calls it the American Mediterranean, betrays a commitment to the narrative of racial harmony espoused by many writers at the time who compared American systems of racial apartheid unfavorably to what they saw as the more fluid arrangements in the West Indies. For Buell, Jamaicans seemed unusually contented and, quote, remarkably loyal to the crown, and thus uninterested, Garvey notwithstanding, in any form of self-determination. U.S. agribusiness was the culprit for Buell, and Jamaica, for him, stood in a much better position than Puerto Rico or Cuba, quote, simply because the economy of the island is based not upon the single crop of sugar produced by foreign plantations, but upon diversified agriculture, bananas, sugar, coffee, pimento, much of which is in the hand of the peasant farmer. Jamaican peasants, in Buell's view, were beneficiaries of several land reform programs and the general lushness of the island, leading him to assert that, quote, nobody goes without food. Buell's argument here is reminiscent of Lord Sidney Olivier's. Olivier, a Fabian socialist and advocate of communal land ownership, had been governor of Jamaica on 3 occasions in the first decade of the 20th century. He was convinced that the future of the West Indies lay in the support of peasant production and was eager for others to recognize what he saw unequivocally as an example of peaceful, multiracial development. Olivier thus invited William Macmillan, a Scottish-born South African historian who in 1934 resigned from the department he founded and built at Wits to visit Jamaica and the West Indies more broadly. Olivier knew Macmillan was working on a book about development possibilities on the African continent and suggested that the West Indies would provide a model for the new African colonies to emulate. Macmillan, however, was appalled by the conditions of poverty and apathy in each of the islands he visited. While granting that, quote, race relations were relatively harmonious, he nevertheless displeased Olivier by reporting that the intransigence of planters, coupled with the failure of the Crown Colony imperial government to, quote, carry its burden of responsibility for the unrepresented masses, end quote, provided no example for African development. Indeed, his sense in the original edition of the text that emerged from this visit, Warning from the West Indies, was that poverty, hunger, and the lack of provisions for public health, education, and infrastructure prevented the development of political consciousness among the masses of the population. Of course, this latter argument was to be proven wrong when, after the book's original publication, the labor riots broke out across the British West Indies. This occurrence, unthinkable for him at the time, prompted him to write a new preface for the 1938 Penguin paperback edition. This time he asserted that what happened in the West Indies was a, quote, warning of what we are to expect in other parts of the empire unless our responsibilities come to be deliberately accepted, end quote. Macmillan's inquiries were taking place just as Ethiopianism began to enjoy a revival as a result of Italy's 1935 invasion of Ethiopia, and right before Leonard Howell established his Rastafari commune at Pinnacle in 1940. Among both the Jamaican white population and the respectable middle classes in this late colonial period, in the latter case, those who were developing into a civically oriented group of professionals and businessmen, a discourse of fear of these alternative expressions and imaginations of sovereignty was emerging. Yet nowhere in Warning does he mention the emergent Rastafari nor a lingering Garveyism. Zora seems similarly uninterested in these aspects of Jamaican social and political life at the time. And Buell, too, missed the various strands of nationalism emerging among various classes in Jamaica and linked this to the lack of a vibrant local cultural scene. Quote, the political dependence of the Jamaicans upon alien rule undoubtedly explains why the cultural and political life of this island is so scanty, he wrote. No doubt this was because they have attempted barrenly to pattern their lives after Englishmen. This sentiment is implicit within Zora's observations of the Jamaican middle class and would also have been Jean Prismar's argument at that very moment in Haiti. Of course, I'm speaking here of Ainsi parla l'oncle, published in 1928, a text that reevaluated and affirmed African-derived folklore in Haiti as the necessary foundation for nationalist development and cultural self-esteem within the context of US occupation. While Herskovits had publicized the Africanism's paradigm, he was, as Kevin Yelvington has pointed out, only one scholar within a broader network concerned to think through the political uses of elaborating an African cultural heritage. This network included Jean Prismars, and Herskowitz's unacknowledged theoretical debt to Prismars is evident throughout Life in Haitian Valley, in which he discusses a combite system of cooperative economic production, marketing, extended family systems, and the institution of plaçage, deference toward elders, and especially Vodun as elements of a West African and specifically Dahomean cultural heritage. For Prismars, the politics of acknowledging Vodun and other peasant practices as central to Haitian culture writ large had to do with the rejection not only of the US occupation, but also of what he called bovarisme collectif among middle-class Haitians. Prismars was not alone in seeking to quick-start radical politics during the so-called Second Independence post-occupation. As historian Matthew Smith has shown us, a number of Marxist and Noiriste organizations formed after 1934, yet because these oppositional groups were divided in their attempts to grab state power, and because these attempts became increasingly violent, the Noirisme that ultimately became dominant under Duvalier was not the political solution Prismars had envisioned, one of a shared national culture, rural and urban, rooted in a dynamic Vodun, among other peasant practices. Jamaica, therefore, for someone like Buell, remained the West Indies' best hope. Quote, when Jamaica is eventually given home rule, he wrote, the people of the island, having lived under foreign tutelage for years, should start without any of the handicaps that have prevented Negro self-government in Haiti and Liberia from having a fair trial. It may be that Jamaica will be the testing ground for the capacity of the Black race, he continued. It will be a great day for this race when Jamaica is admitted as a sister dominion to that great association of free nations known as the British Commonwealth. For Buell, self-government in the Caribbean is inevitable, but Zora takes Haiti's example as a cautionary tale. Based on her quotidian debates there, she argues that Haitians, regardless of class background, have, quote, a marked tendency to refuse responsibility for anything that is unfavorable. Some outside influence, they say, usually the United States or Santo Domingo, and remember, this is the time of the massacre on the border, right? She says, is responsible for all the ills of Haiti. They argue, she asserts, that the US occupation made a poor country like Haiti even poorer. She raises one example, a conversation with a man whom she reminds that he himself had told her, quote, that the occupation brought a great deal of money here, which you were sorry to lose. To which he responds that American Marines saw that their country was rich, quote, and so they came and robbed until we grew tired of it and drove them away. She counters, you evidently were very slow to wrath because they stayed here 19 years, I believe. And he responds, yes, and we would have let them stay here longer, but the Americans have no politeness, so we drove them out. For the Haitian man, Americans are greedy and boorish, and thus uncultured, though wealthy. Zora doesn't entertain the implications of his critique, and instead writes, quote, all this was spoken with the utmost gravity. If I did not know that every word of it was a lie, I would have been bound to believe him. His lies were that bold and brazen. His statements presuppose that I could not read, and even if I could, that there were no historical documents and evidence that dealt with Haiti. I soon learned to accept these insults to my intelligence without protest because they happen so often. What do we make of a statement like this? Or of her trip to Ile de la Gonave, where she meets a sergeant of the Garde d'Haïti, whom she often hears yelling things like, Jesus Christ, and God damn, mixed up in his Creole. When we become friendly enough to converse, she writes, I told him that I had heard him and said it was remarkable to hear these ejaculations from him. He tells her that he served with the Marines during the occupation. She reports that she greeted this tidbit of information facetiously, replying, then you are a Black Marine? He comes back proudly, I am a Black Marine. I speak like one always. Perhaps you would like me to kill something for you. I kill that dog for you. It was a half-starved dog, she says, that had taken to hanging around me. She argues with him to put the gun away and spare the dog, then sarcastically says that she heard later that he was telling his friends he must be just like an American Marine because the femme américaine had recognized the likeness at once. Again, here, Zora is refusing the critique of US imperialism and the implication of this man's utterances and performances that for the Marines, Haitians were like mangy dogs. Remember, for her, the coming of the Marines was the beginning of peace. In part, we might attribute this failure to more radically apprehend the political dynamics surrounding her, to her sense that to be a woman in the West Indies was always to be an object, and thus to her suspicion that men were always lying to her. If you tried to talk sense, she writes, they look at you pitifully as if to say, what a pity. That mouth that was made to supply some man, and why not me, with kisses, is spoiling itself asking stupidities about banana production and wages. For Zora, being a black woman in the Caribbean was no better than being a donkey, whereas in the United States, she argued, being born a girl means, quote, you are born with the law in your mouth. The majority of the solid citizens strain their ears trying to find out what it is their womenfolk want so they can strain around and try to get it for them. She continues, and that is a very good idea and the right way to look at things. For anyone familiar with her own romantic history and her struggles to maintain a career while loving, this would seem to be a strange assessment of things. But we might also remember her deep suspicion of the race men of her day, whom she famously dismissed as windbags and demagogues, as well as her own hesitations about involving herself in her own political moment. And we definitely should remember Alice Walker's assertion that we don't love Zora, quote, for her lack of modesty. We do not love her for her unpredictable and occasionally weird politics. We do not certainly applaud many of the mad things she is alleged to have said and sometimes actually did say. We do not even claim never to dislike her. We love Zora Neale Hurston for her work first. In the case of Tell My Horse, as in her other more anthropologically oriented texts, this means we love her for the life she brings to folk practices. And this brings me to the second important analytic trajectory for a contemporary reading of Tell My Horse. This is her insistence on a view of Black sociality produced through the maintenance of life. Voodoo, and she uses voodoo. Voodoo, she insists, is a religion of creation and life. And in both Jamaica and Haiti, she goes to great lengths to document the funerary rituals characteristic of each locale, tying them also to practices in other areas of the diaspora. In Jamaica, Zora tells us that when a person dies, quote, it is a rigid rule that the whole district must participate in the ensuing rituals called a nine-night. She shows how every precaution is taken to make sure the death is a good death, with a good death being a permanent one. The body has to be prepared, with limes and nutmeg being rubbed on the deceased's nose, mouth, under his arms, and between his legs. The body has to be fed, but never with salt, because salt will make the body heavy and unable to leave the world of the living. The body has to be placed in a coffin with its head atop a pillow, inside of which are sewn parched peas, corn, and coffee beans. Nails have to be driven through the cuffs of the deceased's shirt, the heels of the deceased's socks. The coffin has to be, quote, lowered with proper rituals and padded to rest in the earth, and a trail of salt and ground coffee has to be laid from the grave to the house door. Songs are lined out hour after hour, all of this so that the duppy of the deceased, his ghost, would not return. The duppy, one of Zora's Jamaican informants tells her, quote, is the most powerful part of any man. Everybody has evil in him, he continues. And when a man is alive, the heart and the brain controls him, and he will not abandon himself to many evil things. But when the duppy leaves the body, it no longer has anything to restrain it, and it will do more terrible things than any man ever dreamed of. It's not good for a duppy to stay among living folk. The duppy is much too powerful and is apt to hurt people all the time. So, he concluded, we make nine-night to force the duppy to stay in his grave. On the 9th night after death, everyone in the district convenes at the house again, this time for singing music and joviality, the goal being to give the deceased a happy send-off, quote, so that he will rest well and never come back again. In Haiti, she says, duppies are called zombies. They are the living dead, bodies without souls, and she was privileged enough on her trip to photograph one, something she said no one else had ever done. Haitian zombies fascinate Zora, and she's interested to find out why zombies are not allowed to rest. She's given many answers. These are the answers she's given. A was awakened because somebody required his body to be a beast of burden. In his natural state, he never could have been hired to work with his hands, so he was made into a zombie because they wanted his services as a laborer. B was summoned to labor also, but he is reduced to the level of beast as an act of revenge. C was the culmination of Bamun ceremony and pledge. That is, he was given as a sacrifice to pay off a debt to spirits for benefits received. While the dead are called on to continue to labor, which would seem to be the real instantiation of Patterson's social death or Winter's coloniality of being, she also reports that they are used as sneak thieves and, if we are to believe her informants, to marry off their daughters. Her argument is that, quote, if embalming were customary, it would remove the possibility of zombies from the minds of the people. But since it's not done, she says, many families take precautions against the body being disturbed. As in Jamaica, she proceeds to describe ritual practices surrounding death, setting up watch in the cemetery for 36 hours after burial, cutting the body open, or just putting a knife in the right hand of the corpse, flexed, quote, in such a way that it will deal a blow with the knife to whoever disturbs it the first day or so, and even poisoning the body. She discusses Gede, the entirely Haitian, that is to say, non-syncretized Loa, who is also known to be a grave robber, among other things. And she reflects on the subtleties of using graveyard dirt to maim and kill. Soil from deep in an old grave has prestige wherever the Negro exists in the Western world, Zora tells us. She surmises that this belief may, quote, come out of the ancestor worship of West Africa, making it a, quote, African survival of sorts. In Jamaica, Haiti, and wherever the Negro exists in the New World, the funerary ritual practices Zora documents stem from a strong belief in survival after death, or rather, as she argues, that there is no death. Activities are merely changed from one condition to another. This is an insight historian Vince Brown states is encapsulated by the Akan Adinkra Nyame Nwu Na Mawu, loosely translated, God does not die, so I cannot die. In The Reaper's Garden, Brown's exploration of death and power in the 18th century Atlantic world, he argues that the notion that the dead are, quote, active participants in the living world reveals death as a transition between the physical and immaterial states of being. In Jamaica, funerals revealed common cosmological orientations and generated a shared moral universe among slaves. By participating in funerary rites, Brown writes, quote, they recovered their common humanity. They assumed and affirmed meaningful social roles, and they rendered communal values sacred by associating them with the dead, end quote. Where Zora documents early 20th century practices, Brown describes those prevalent in the 18th century as people from a variety of ethnic groups met each other on New World soil, continuing old and developing new rituals designed to, quote, send spirits properly on their way to the other world, to make sure they had sufficient foodstuffs, tobacco, and drink to nourish them on their journey, and that they were spurred on by song and dance. In light of the continued importance of these practices concerning death and burial from the 18th century to the 20th, and yes, they're still important in the 21st, I'm wondering whether Zora can tell us something about Black life today, something about how death might be an ontological and even hauntological touchstone without being the definition of non-existence or absence. Is it possible to be human, socially and politically, in the wake of the plantation? To answer this question, many have looked to the ways early colonial elaborations of racialized notions of difference were established during the early period of both settler and exploitation colonialism, and then mobilized to serve late 19th century projects of indirect imperial rule throughout Africa and South Asia, as well as the emergent imperialism of the United States. This has been the bailiwick of scholars of empire who, over the past 30 years, have chronicled the diverse legislative twists and turns that emerged to govern the forms of political, economic, and intimate relations throughout the long histories of Spanish, Dutch, and British colonial rule. Many have also turned their attention to the ways anti-colonial and nationalist projects sought to interrogate, critique, and ultimately revise these originary delineations of the relationships between personhood, value, and political legibility through the development of new forms of community cultural consciousness, if not always substantially new economic arrangements. Indeed, the elaboration of continuities between imperial and nationalist modalities of governance has been a critical focus for these scholars, including attention, in the case of New World societies, to the ongoing forms of violence that have been enacted against Black bodies. While these oftentimes brilliant analyses have yielded trenchant critiques of the diverse vectors of subjectification, I have also felt that they have often stopped just short of the more sensory dimensions of subjectivity and have therefore left us largely unable to answer other also pertinent questions. This is in part because much of this work, inspired by Foucault and Agamben, does not recognize the centrality of race and racializing assemblages. This is Alex Wehele's term, one he uses to encourage us to reconceptualize the relationships among race, humanity, and subjectification, and Alex mentioned this earlier, as a set of sociopolitical processes that discipline humanity into full humans, not quite humans, and non-humans. Race here, as the organizing principle of modern capitalist production and labor regimes, always prefigures modern notions of what it means to be a human and potentially a citizen. It thus also undergirds what it feels like to be a problem, to have the need for second sight, to recognize the interpolation insisted upon by the phrase, "Look, a Negro." If we do not account for the ways Afro-descended people find ourselves as objects in the midst of other objects, ontologically impossible without violence and exiled from the human relation, then we cannot fully account for subjectivity's discursive entanglements. And if Blackness cannot stand on its own as humanity, but must always be recognized through, by, or vis-a-vis whiteness, then sovereign violence is in part the constant failure of double consciousness. This would be the Afro-pessimist line, and it's a theoretically powerful one, moving beyond political economy, and therefore also beyond imagining the efficacy of particular forms of political struggle, and it instead engages the psychic foundations of the modern world as anti-Black. This mode of theorizing importantly points to the limitations of both our analytics and our strategies, as it offers a logic of the centrality of the slave relation, one that transcends time and space, of how and why recognition of Black presence is impossible, where whiteness is not only always presence, but also absolute perspectivity. Like all logics, this is, as Lévi-Strauss would have said, good to think with. But of course, logics must be understood as contingent. They can only exist in the world as engagements, always in motion, always entertaining the possibility of human action. In his seminal article in the volume Biko Lives, Frank Wilderson writes about having faced the threat of death in South Africa during a discussion in 1992 about an upcoming mass protest that would, by crashing through a fence, liberate people in the homeland of Ciskei. During their planning meeting, they find out that the general, the ruler of that homeland, has stated that if the protesters cross the border en masse, he will open fire on them. When they hear this, they cheer and applaud. Why? Wilderson explains that, quote, a threat in response to the gesture of our collective, our living will, made us feel as though we were alive, as though we possessed what, in fact, we could not possess, human life as opposed to Black life. We could die because we lived. He argues that this was an affective rather than discursive response of ontological discovery. And he uses this story to inaugurate a discussion of the logic undergirding so-called Afro-pessimism. What's striking to me about the story, however, is that life is realized and recognized at the moment of the threshold of death. Zora, too, preoccupied with the rituals surrounding death and the constant appearance and antics of those who should be dead, turns her most careful attention to those practices that are geared toward maintaining the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The elaboration of ritual attention to this boundary should tell us that there is something important about keeping death out of life. Classically, this threshold marks the sphere of liminality, about which anthropologists have had much to say. Victor Turner's well-known argument was that within ritual processes, there is a moment of transition, for him the margin, or the limen, which signifies threshold in Latin, during which point ambiguity reigns. The initiate, having been detached from the group and his previous state, now possesses none of the attributes of the past state, nor those of the state that will be brought into being. Liminality is the space in which norms of law, custom, convention, and ceremony are thrown up in the air. Liminal entities possess nothing, they have no status or property, no position within a kinship system, no individual will. Initians are bound by egalitarianism and the comradeship of communitas as they confront, quote, a moment in and out of time and in and out of secular social structure, which reveals, however fleetingly, some recognition in symbol, if not always in language, of a generalized social bond that has ceased to be and has simultaneously yet to be fragmented into a multiplicity of structural ties, end quote. For Turner, as for most structuralists, this liminal phase would have been part of a dialectical cycle whose resolution would have entered the initiand into the sphere of the properly social. But for Black studies, this is life on the threshold, on the run, underground, in the margins, a refusal of the world that the world lives in. What is required to recognize this life, to enact disalienation, to restore relationality, to witness? Wilderson's articulation of the difference between finding space for being human within affect rather than discourse is an important one. In my own work, I've been interested these days in assembling archives of affect. This is Gail Wald's term, one she mobilizes to understand the late 1960s and early 1970s television variety show Soul as both a reflection of contemporary realities as well as an embodiment of dreams for a Black is beautiful future. Archiving here is not oriented toward the past and its preservation, but is instead intended to suggest new possibilities for social and political relations, relations that in this case are generated through popular cultural expression. Nadia Ellis has called this elaboration of possibility improvisation, an embodied affective register through which African diasporic people enact survival under conditions of unpredictability and multiple forms of sovereign violence. This is not quite witnessing, and it's not quite a counter-archive. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to suggest that an archive of affect is not beholden to the nationalist and masculinist discursive frames that often contextualize counter-archives. Nor is it bound to the teleologies of time within African diasporic spaces that often render the past as a lost object, one that must be retrieved in order to imagine a future. Instead, archives of affect, because they are nonlinear and thus unobligated to particular pedagogical and temporal predispositions, can be called upon to perform other kinds of tasks. They can help us to understand how the practices and performances of state sovereignty and the attempts to create life alongside, through, and in opposition to them are embodied and thus transmitted both corporally and structurally. They can shift the politics of repair away from discretely local and legally verifiable events toward the long and slow processes undermining our ability to forge social and political community together. They can urge us to become more skeptical about nationalist narratives of perfectibility, whereby we triumph over past prejudices and injustices through the force of will and a commitment to moral right. Instead, they can encourage us to train our vision more pointedly to transnational geopolitical and sociocultural spheres and to the messy entanglements that characterize sovereignty at different moments. At the same time, they can help us to focus on the everyday ways people innovate life without constantly projecting today's struggle into a future redemption. And finally, archives of affect comprise the immaterial ways in which we are called to recognize ourselves and each other, and to cultivate a sense of mutuality that not only exposes complicity, but also demands collective accountability. They are, in the end, technologies of deep recognition. To my mind, this is the kind of assemblage Zora gives us across the body of her work. In Search of Our Mother's Garden, Alice Walker famously characterized Zora as always upholding a sense of, quote, racial health, a sense of Black people as complete, complex, undiminished human beings. To be undiminished in this way requires a healthy dose of irony, a robust sense of humor, a profound commitment to endurance, and a deep love. I, like Fred Moten and Fanon before him and Du Bois before him and Zora always, am moved to embrace love. A love that, like Césaire's Return, Brathwaite's Submarine, or Benitez Rojo's Islands, unites and repeats. I embrace love because I embrace contingency, processuality, disaggregation, playfulness, surprise, and improvisation. I embrace love because before I was an anthropologist, I was a dancer. And as all dancers know, there is that moment when body becomes spirit, becomes something more than the sum of its parts, when we become consciously human by doing something with our bodies together. I embrace love when I am laughing, and then again when I am feeling mean and impressive. I embrace love in the little repetitions of life, the making of breakfast, the drop-off at school, the teaching of class, the endless meetings. I experience these repetitions like chants, the thumps and chants and dances of revival and kumana, and other Afro-diasporic spiritual traditions in which repetition is intended to produce a state of trance. In this state, we communicate with beings and things unseen. We exceed our bodies. We time travel. It's this threshold state that enables affective mutuality and that gives us a sense of how, when, and why the feeling of freedom counteracts the constraints of historical violence in the present. Thanks.
So what I was most struck by is your ending about what does it mean to embrace love.
What does it mean to what?
Embrace love.
Yeah.
And I was also, because we have a connection, how to embrace love in the midst of endless meetings, but no, that's just an aside. But so where do you position yourself and Zora? Because I think that you're channeling Zora in a lot of ways. So where would Zora be in the trajectory that you're actually also outlining, and it's kind of a through line to the last panel, which is between Afro-pessimism and Afrofuturism, right? So I can't see Zora in either one of those places. But the invocation of her today on this 125th anniversary makes me want to understand those two poles through her really complex vision of Black sociality. And so I just want you to channel Zora there as well, because I think you made such a really clear articulation of Wilderson and the Afro-pessimist position. And previously, Sarah, you made such a really clear and lucid articulation of the Afrofuturist position. So I would love to actually hear Zora sort of riff on that too, if you can channel her again.
Let me get myself into a trance state. No. The thing that makes me, I guess, come back to Zora over and over is just her commitment to the everyday. I mean, it's what you love, too. It's the what is happening in people's quotidian lives. That shows us what our values are. What our beliefs are about sociality, community. Outside of the programmatic visions for understanding the past or shaping the future. And I think that's the lesson that is so important in what she gives us, because she rejects those programs in her own time, and she has political positions that today we would not find progressive necessarily. So what she gives us over and over throughout all of her texts is the value of Black life in the day-to-day, and that, I think, is what's so beautiful about her work. And then in theoretical terms, what's, what pushes us beyond both of those poles, and instead sort of reminds us all the time, which is not to say, don't struggle for the vision or for various kinds of visions or constantly look for ways to improve life, but it's to say that, it's always messy, it's always complicated, it's always contingent. No logic can explain everything for all time and all places. People are tricky and weird, and they surprise you, and they do bizarre things, and they do interesting things, and they do really heroic things, but they do this in the day-to-day, and they do this with each other in the day-to-day. So to me, again, what's important about her outlining of Black life is that, this is about a mutuality that's worked out together relationally every day. And I think that's the commitment theoretically.